deep within the lush green folds of a tropical jungle, where sunlight danced through a canopy of leaves and the air hummed with life, something extraordinary once happened. Something almost no one would believe if it hadn't been witnessed firsthand. This isn't the story of a wild animal gone rogue. No. This is the story of a silent guardian, a creature feared by many, yet capable of something we humans often forget we share: loyalty, memory, and love. Her name was Leah, just 8 years old, bright-eyed and endlessly curious. She lived in a small research outpost near the sanctuary with her father, a zoologist dedicated to studying primates. While most children were kept far from the animals, Leah was different. She didn't just observe the creatures. She connected with them, especially one in particular. His name was Koba, a towering silverback gorilla with shoulders like stone and eyes that held centuries of emotion. He wasn't just intelligent, he was aware of the humans who watched him, aware of the world beyond the fence, and most of all, aware of the little girl who never looked at him with fear. No one quite understood how or why their bond began. Maybe it was because Koba had once lost a baby of his own in the wild. Maybe Leah reminded him of something long buried beneath instinct, but day after day, their silent conversations grew longer. It was the kind of connection no cage could contain, no study could explain. They weren't just girl and gorilla. They were something far deeper. Two souls that recognized each other. But even the strongest bonds can be tested. And the jungle never forgets. Leah's fascination with the jungle grew with every visit. She would often sneak away from her father's side, her small feet crunching softly on the leaves as she made her way to Koba's enclosure. Over time, their bond only deepened. Koba would sit quietly, watching Leah as she approached, his dark eyes filled with curiosity. She, in turn, would smile brightly and press her hand against the thick glass, as if trying to reach him through the barrier. It wasn't long before Leah began bringing Koba small offerings: a stick she found, a colorful flower, or even a piece of fruit. Koba would take them gently, his massive hands surprisingly delicate. The simplicity of their interactions at first seemed insignificant to others, but to Leah and Koba, each moment shared was a building block in a connection that felt unspoken, but undeniable. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The routine became sacred. Leah would visit Koba every afternoon, sitting by the fence, sometimes talking to him about her day or reading from her favorite book. Koba would often sit beside her, his massive body a silent presence, as though listening intently, his eyes never leaving her. Leah had learned to sign a few basic gestures, and Koba, though reluctant at first, began to mirror her movements. When she raised her hand in a wave, Koba would slowly lift his massive arm. When she clapped, he would follow suit, though his claps were more like thunder than anything else. But Leah didn't mind. The fact that Koba was trying meant everything to her. There were moments, too, when Koba would reach out and gently touch the glass, pressing his rough fingertips against hers. It was during these moments that Leah truly felt the depth of their connection. It was more than just an animal showing curiosity. It was as though Koba understood her, or at least saw her in a way that no one else could. And then, one fateful day, something happened that none of them could have anticipated. It would change everything. As the months passed, Leah and Koba's friendship became the heart of the sanctuary. Their bond was no longer just an oddity to be observed. It was a symbol of something greater, something rare. People began to notice how Koba seemed to respond to Leah's voice, how his eyes would follow her every movement, as though he understood her presence, her emotions. The other animals in the sanctuary took note too, often watching curiously from their enclosures as Leah and Koba shared these intimate, quiet moments. Leah's father, who had initially been cautious about their closeness, began to see something profound in their relationship. He marveled at how Koba, despite being a wild creature, seemed to show a gentle side when Leah was near. It was as though the gorilla had taken on the role of protector, and Leah, in turn, had become his companion. It wasn't just a girl and a gorilla. It was a unique friendship that defied the natural order of things. And the more time they spent together, the more Koba seemed to understand her. He would watch over her from a distance, always alert, always protective. Leah would often talk to Koba about her life, about the things she didn't always have the words to say to others. She'd tell him about her hopes, her dreams, and the things that scared her. And though Koba couldn't speak, his presence was comforting, reassuring, as if he understood her completely. It wasn't just the silent moments that brought them closer, but the sense of trust they had in each other. Leah trusted Koba with her deepest feelings, and Koba trusted her with his quiet strength. Sometimes they would simply sit together in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the trees. Leah would lean against the fence, her eyes heavy with the weight of a long day, while Koba would remain by her side, still as a statue, his dark eyes watching over her like a silent sentinel. And in those moments, Leah would feel an overwhelming sense of peace, as though nothing in the world could ever harm her as long as Koba was near. For all the moments of joy they shared, there were still mysteries that surrounded Koba. There were things he knew, things he understood, that none of the researchers could quite explain. There was a depth in his gaze, a knowledge that seemed ancient. It wasn't until later that Leah would come to realize just how far Koba's protection would go, and how much he was willing to risk for her. But that, she would learn, was a story still to be told. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the jungle grew quiet, something changed. It was a typical night at the sanctuary, the animals settling in, the researchers finishing their rounds, and Leah saying goodbye to her father before heading back to her room. But as she walked near the fence, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the air. A scream, faint but unmistakable. It was Leah's scream. Her heart raced as she sprinted toward the source of the sound. The jungle, usually peaceful at this hour, seemed to pulse with a strange energy. She reached the edge of the sanctuary and saw them, men, shadows moving in the darkness. They were carrying large nets and ropes, their faces hidden by masks. Leah froze, her blood running cold. They were poachers, and they were here for Koba. Panic surged through her. She tried to shout, but her voice was lost in the rustling of leaves as one of the men grabbed her arm, pulling her back roughly. She struggled, but the poacher's grip was too strong. "Get away from the fence!" he hissed, shoving her aside. Leah stumbled, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she hit her head against a rock. Her vision blurred, and before she could comprehend what had happened, everything went dark. Meanwhile, Koba, hearing the commotion, was no longer the calm protector. He had watched the poachers approach for some time, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. But when he saw Leah fall, when he heard her distress, something inside him snapped. His primal instincts took over. With a roar that could shake the heavens, Koba charged toward the poachers. He smashed through the fence, his enormous body moving with terrifying speed and power. The men barely had time to react as Koba grabbed one of them by the collar and threw him aside like a rag doll. The other poachers, panic-stricken, tried to retreat, but Koba was relentless. He swiped at them with such force that trees trembled. The poachers, realizing they had underestimated the power of the silverback, turned to flee, abandoning their mission. Koba, though furious, did not pursue them further. His focus shifted back to Leah, who lay unconscious on the ground. He knelt beside her, his massive hands gently brushing her hair back, his eyes filled with an unsettling mix of fear and determination. Koba knew the danger wasn't over. The poachers would be back, and next time they might not fail. He needed to protect Leah, no matter the cost. As the sound of retreating footsteps faded into the night, Koba stood tall, his eyes scanning the jungle around him. He had no words, but his message was clear. He would not let anyone harm the girl he had once saved. and he would do whatever it took to ensure she was safe. Days passed since the attack, but the aftermath weighed heavily on everyone at the sanctuary. Leah remained in the hospital, unconscious and recovering from the blow to her head. Her father stayed by her side, heartbroken and worried, unaware of the true extent of what had happened. The sanctuary was on high alert, the researchers doubling their security. But there was one thing they didn't understand: the depth of Koba's anger. In the quiet of the night, Koba made his move. He had spent days pacing the jungle, silently waiting, watching. He knew the poachers would return. They always did, and this time, he wouldn't let them get away. Using every ounce of his strength and intelligence, Koba broke free from the sanctuary's boundaries, slipping into the dark shadows of the forest. He moved with purpose, each step calculated, every sound he made muffled by the thick jungle underbrush. His massive frame, usually imposing and loud, became a shadow. He was no longer just a gorilla. He was a force of nature, bent on protecting the girl he had once saved. Koba knew the scent of the poachers. He could track them with ease, his heightened senses guiding him through the night. The air was thick with the smell of human sweat, the faint odor of the men who had dared to hurt Leah. And it wasn't just the scent of fear that burned in his nostrils. It was the scent of betrayal. One by one, Koba followed the trail. The poachers had returned to their camp, thinking they had escaped unnoticed. They were wrong. Koba was already there, waiting in the shadows. His dark eyes locked on the men as they sat by their fire. They hadn't seen him approach, hadn't heard the rustling of the leaves. He was a ghost. The first poacher felt a shift in the air. He turned, but it was too late. Koba lunged forward, moving faster than any man could anticipate. His massive hand grabbed the poacher by the arm, twisting it with terrifying strength, throwing him to the ground with a force that shook the earth beneath them. The man cried out in pain, but Koba's gaze was unrelenting. He wasn't here to kill, he was here to make a statement. The poacher would leave with more than just a bruise. He would leave with a memory. The remaining men scrambled, trying to grab their weapons, but Koba was already on them. He moved through them like a storm, a blur of raw power and fury. But he wasn't careless. Each strike was measured, calculated. His goal wasn't to slaughter them, it was to break their resolve, to make them understand the cost of their actions. He would show them that no one would harm Leah again. When the poachers were finally scattered, beaten and bruised but alive, Koba stood tall, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each deep inhale. He looked down at the men, who were now cowering on the ground, their eyes wide with fear. He made no sound, no growl, just stared, letting them understand that the price for their cruelty had already been paid. With one last piercing glance, Koba turned and disappeared into the jungle, blending into the night as though he had never been there. The poachers would never come back, not after this. And Koba, once a gentle giant, would never be the same again. He had protected Leah, and in doing so had crossed a line from which there would be no return. When Leah awoke, the world around her felt different. The sterile smell of the hospital room, the soft beeping of machines, and the faint hum of distant voices. It all seemed distant. Her head throbbed, the memory of the poacher's attack flashing through her mind like a nightmare. But there was something else lingering in her thoughts, something powerful, something that made her heart race with both fear and awe. Her father sat beside her, his face etched with worry. He was holding her hand, his grip tight, as though afraid to let go. "Leah," he whispered, his voice breaking, "you're safe now. You're going to be okay." But Leah's mind wasn't on her father. Her thoughts were consumed with Koba. She remembered the way he had rushed toward her when she had fallen, the way he had protected her, as if nothing else in the world mattered. And then she remembered the fear in his eyes, not for himself, but for her. Over the next few days, Leah's recovery was swift, but her thoughts remained clouded. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in Koba, that his actions had left an irreversible mark on him. Her bond with him had always been a quiet one, a connection built on trust. But now it was different. She could feel it in her bones. The protector, the gentle giant she had come to know, had transformed into something else, something more fierce, more dangerous. Leah couldn't stay in the hospital forever. As soon as she was able, she convinced her father to take her back to the sanctuary. She needed to see Koba. She needed to know that he was okay, even if it meant facing whatever change had taken root in him. When they arrived at the sanctuary, the air was thick with tension. The other researchers were on edge, constantly scanning the horizon, their eyes darting around nervously. They didn't know the full story, but they could feel the shift. They knew something was off, though they couldn't put it into words. As Leah made her way to Koba's enclosure, her heart pounded in her chest. She was scared, but it wasn't fear of Koba. No, it was fear of what had happened to him, what he had become. She stopped at the edge of the fence, looking through the thick glass, and there he was. Koba sat at the far end of the enclosure, his massive frame still and silent. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything stood still. There was no sound, no movement, just the two of them, locked in that gaze. Leah stepped closer, her heart racing. She pressed her hand against the glass, as she had so many times before. Koba stood slowly, his eyes never leaving hers, and then, to her surprise, he mirrored her actions. He raised his hand, pressing it gently against the glass, his large fingers a stark contrast to her small ones. It was the same, and yet it was different. The bond between them hadn't been broken, but it had changed. Koba had become more than just a protector. He had become a force, an unwavering guardian, someone who would do anything to keep her safe. And while that frightened her, it also gave her a sense of security she couldn't explain. For the first time since the attack, Leah felt a sense of peace. She knew that whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever threats might come their way, Koba would always be there, and he would always protect her, no matter the cost. In that moment, Leah understood something profound. Their bond was unbreakable, but it wasn't without its sacrifices. The jungle had changed Koba, just as it had changed her, and together, they would face whatever came next. Weeks passed since Leah's return to the sanctuary, and life slowly began to regain a sense of normalcy. But while the world around her seemed to move forward, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that the events of that night had irrevocably changed everything. She spent more time with Koba, trying to understand the shift in him, but there was always a quiet intensity in his eyes, a fierce protectiveness that never left him. He was still the same gentle giant she had known, but now he was more watchful, more alert, as though he was constantly guarding against some unseen threat. One evening, as Leah sat near the fence, reading aloud to Koba as she often did, something unusual happened. Koba stood up abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the jungle around them. Leah looked up, following his gaze, but saw nothing. The air felt thick, as though the jungle itself was holding its breath. Koba's movements were swift, his large body tense, and for the first time, Leah felt the weight of his presence as a protector, not just a companion. A rustling noise came from the edge of the sanctuary, and Koba's muscles tensed, his entire form ready for action. Leah's heart raced. She knew the poachers were still a threat. Despite the fear and uncertainty that had settled in her, she trusted Koba completely. He was not only her protector, he was the one who had seen the danger first. Without saying a word, Leah stood up and moved closer to the fence, her eyes never leaving Koba's. A shadow appeared at the perimeter of the sanctuary, and Leah felt a chill run down her spine. There were men, creeping closer, their figures barely visible in the fading light. They were back. Before Leah could even react, Koba was already in motion, his massive frame moving with an urgency Leah had never seen before. The poachers, realizing they had been spotted, froze for a moment, caught off guard by Koba's sudden, intense presence. But Koba was no longer the gentle guardian. He had become the embodiment of the jungle itself, fierce, unstoppable, and terrifying in his pursuit of protection. The poachers scrambled, but Koba was too fast. He charged toward them, his roar deafening as it echoed through the trees. They barely had time to draw their weapons before Koba reached them, knocking one man aside with a force that sent him crashing into a tree. The others tried to flee, but Koba was relentless. He moved like a shadow, a blur of power, making it clear that he would not let anyone harm Leah again. Leah watched from the safety of the fence, her heart pounding in her chest. But she knew Koba would never let anything happen to her. The poachers were no match for the silverback gorilla's fury. They ran, terrified, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape the unstoppable force that was Koba. In a matter of minutes, the jungle fell silent again, the only sound the heavy breathing of Koba as he stood tall, his eyes scanning the perimeter to ensure the danger had passed. Leah slowly approached the fence, her legs shaky but determined. She placed her hand against the glass once again, and Koba, with a slow, deliberate motion, mirrored her. Their hands met through the barrier, a silent promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. But Leah knew that this wasn't over. The poachers would return, they always did. And Koba, now more than ever, would be ready. The bond between them had only grown stronger, and while the jungle had tested them both, it had also forged something unbreakable. Koba would protect Leah no matter the cost, and she would stand by him, because together they were more than just girl and gorilla. They were a force that nothing and no one could tear apart. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and orange, Leah and Koba stood together in the fading light, their hands pressed against the glass. A new chapter had begun, one where they would face the world, side by side, against any challenge that lay ahead. The days that followed were filled with tension. The poachers had been driven off, but their threat still loomed in the distance. Everyone at the sanctuary knew it was only a matter of time before they returned, and when they did, they would come with more force. Koba had made his stance clear. He would protect Leah no matter the cost. But the sanctuary staff was growing increasingly worried about what that protection might look like. Koba's behavior had changed, and with it, the entire dynamic at the sanctuary was shifting. Leah, however, refused to be afraid. She spent more time with Koba, trying to reconnect with the gorilla she had known. But she could see the difference in him. He wasn't the same playful, gentle giant he once was. He was more guarded, more tense, as though he was constantly preparing for the next battle. Leah understood why, of course, but it didn't stop her from feeling the weight of the change. The jungle had made Koba into something else, something more fierce, and there were moments when Leah could see the wildness in his eyes. One afternoon, as Leah approached Koba's enclosure, she noticed something unusual. He wasn't sitting by the fence as he usually did. Instead, he was pacing restlessly, his eyes darting back and forth across the jungle. Leah hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She had grown used to Koba's presence, but now there was an edge to him that she hadn't seen before. The researchers had already noticed it too. They were more cautious, giving Koba space, knowing that his protective instincts were heightened. But Leah couldn't let fear control her. She took a deep breath and walked closer to the fence, her heart beating in her chest. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but she knew she had to try. She needed to reach Koba again, to remind him of the connection they had. As she reached the edge of the enclosure, Koba stopped pacing. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, it felt as if time stood still. There was no fear in his gaze, no aggression, just an intense, unwavering focus. Leah slowly raised her hand, pressing it against the glass as she had so many times before. Koba watched her, his massive body still, and then, without hesitation, he raised his own hand and placed it gently against the glass. The moment was brief, but it was enough. For just that second, Leah felt the old bond return. the one that had always been there, beneath the surface. Koba's touch was different now, more powerful, more deliberate, but it was still the same. He was still Koba, the gorilla who had saved her, who had protected her, and who would always stand by her side. But even as the connection between them remained strong, Leah couldn't ignore the reality that the danger was far from over. The poachers had not given up, and they would stop at nothing to capture Koba. The sanctuary could not protect him forever, and Koba knew that better than anyone. His instincts told him that the final confrontation was coming. He would not let anyone harm Leah again, but at what cost? As night fell and the jungle grew quiet, Leah found herself standing by the fence once more. She watched Koba as he stood, alert and vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon. She knew what he was thinking. He was waiting, preparing. But Leah also knew that he wasn't alone. She was with him, and together they would face whatever came next. Whatever danger threatened them, they would face it together. No one could break their bond, not the poachers, not the jungle, nothing. The wind picked up, and the trees whispered around them. The jungle was alive with secrets, but Leah and Koba had their own story now. One that would not be silenced by fear. They had survived the darkness before, and they would survive it again. Together, they were unstoppable.